Hi, I'm Rob Day. I'm a product specialist with ResearchSpace, and today I'm going to show you some of the new features in our brand new ResearchSpace Inventory Management module. So this module is the result of over 2 years of research and development by ResearchSpace, and it's going to be a free add-on to all Enterprise Edition RSpace customers. So if you already have your own ResearchSpace server, you will immediately see this new inventory tab as soon as we update your server to the very latest version. Once you can see this tab, you can go ahead and click on it, and that will take you to the new module. And the first thing that you'll notice here is that there are 3 major panels here. The first panel, we sometimes call it just the control panel, and this one includes some major filters for letting you choose what it is you'd like to look at today. And it also lets you do things like sign out of the system or go back to the ELN or bring up the written documentation. Once you've learned all the text here, you can actually click this icon and just collapse down that text so that you can have a little bit more free space on the screen. The remaining 2 panels are made up of what we call a navigational panel. This is the heart of the system, and it's sort of analogous to the Windows File Explorer or the Macintosh Finder, in that it's where you can locate the things that you want to work with. Now, you can use this either as a search engine. You can apply a range of exciting different sorts of very precise filters to let you focus in just on the things you're interested in, or you can customize the view here to navigate the system in various ways, including you can turn on, if you want, a tree view, which will let you browse through the hierarchies of your containers within which you contain your samples or your resources or the items that you typically work with. So the main navigational tool is this first panel here on the left. On the right, we have what we call the Details panel. And the Details panel allows you to see information about the currently selected item in the navigational tree. So if I click something else here, you'll see that the Details panel will change to show me the details of a different item. Notice that as I select these different items, the details in this panel change because this Details panel is extremely customizable and very smart, and it's designed to show you just information about the particular thing that you've selected in the tree on the left. Both of these panels are highly customizable to let you set up the system in your preferred way so that you can navigate in a way that works for you. The details area always includes a preview image which lets you see the item that you're working with, and if you want to, you can use the search engine to find more specific things. And once you've found something that you're looking for, you should be able to recognize it immediately based on the image that you've previously associated with this details card. The other piece of good news is that right now, although we're looking at the inventory system on a Macintosh using a Safari browser, RSpace is highly responsive. So if I were to change the size of my window here, you'll notice that at a certain point, the system will revert to showing me just one panel at a time. And this is fairly typical if you're using a mobile device. RSpace has been specifically optimized for working with mobile devices to make sure that you always get a nice clear view of what you're looking at. And the screen will adapt to work with whatever mobile device you typically use in the lab to make sure that you can always see your inventory information nice and clearly on whatever size screen you happen to use. Okay, so to recap, we've got the navigational tree and we've got the details tree. Let's take a look at the navigational tree and look at some of the key features here. Well, the first thing to note is that using the control panel on the left, I can turn on these large-scale filters if I want to opt to look only at my containers or to look only at samples. I can also choose to look only at sample templates if I prefer. So you can immediately choose which of these major categories of things to look at. Another important category here is your lab bench. This allows you to see samples that are specifically on your bench right now that you currently may be working with. Anything in RSpace that doesn't have a location, and that can include typically samples that you've just made that you don't have anywhere to put yet, always start their life on your bench. You can find them there after you've made them, and then you can move them to whatever container you like, or you can build and create suitable containers or hierarchic container arrays to allow yourself to store these samples as necessary after you've created them. You can also move items to your bench at any time, or you can move them to the benches of your colleagues in your lab if you want, to indicate that you'd like that user to start working with that particular sample. So I'm going to start by looking at just my containers. And you'll see here that right now we also have a secondary filter window available to me that allows me again to choose whether or not I want to look at just containers, samples, or subsamples, or whether or not I'd like to focus on items that I'm working with currently, or items that are in the trash, or both current items and items that have already been moved to the trash. You'll also see in this main filter box any saved searches that you've made in the past that can be used as sort of dynamic, smart folders of materials that you're interested in looking at. I can close this extra filter window by clicking this little icon here anytime I want. So you can see I can bring it back, or I can close it with this icon. And I can now look at my different containers. Now, a good best practice when you're working with inventory is to start out by building your largest top-level containers that represent major storage areas in your particular lab. So this might mean your lab itself, particular research rooms, freezers, cupboards, storage areas. Top-level containers are a good way to start building the system, because then each individual user can then make the smaller containers inside the existing top-level containers that maybe you or one of the lab admins have built. I can select one of these containers at any time, and that's going to show me, in this case, a picture of a freezer room. And now I can scroll down a little bit and I can see that in this particular freezer room we have one freezer. I can click on that icon and that will take me to see the freezer that I've just selected. And then inside that freezer I can see we have a number of different samples and containers. So I could, if I wanted to, click on the very first container. That appears to be a box of some sort. And inside that box we have a range of different kinds of samples. I can click on one of these samples and now I'll be able to see this is actually a subsample drawn from a collection of a larger sample that's already been created somewhere. So I can see here this is part of this sample here. So if I click on that sample link, a sample is really a family of subsamples or aliquots. So it's very common in science to work with either a stock solution or a particular single sample, which you'll then typically break into smaller subsamples that you'll then use in your experiments. And RSpace is highly customizable so that you can actually control what you call those subsamples for different kinds of samples and choose a language that's suitable for your particular sector or your particular research flows. You can see here that when I scroll down on the details of this sample card, we have a lot of metadata that's been set up so that I can enter metadata in these particular fields. And then down the bottom, I can see a list of all of the different subsamples that comprise this sample. So if I want to, I could maybe click on one of those, and that's now going to give me information just about that particular subsample. Samples are really more of a conceptual item in that they really consist of a family of subsamples, whereas the subsamples themselves tend to be the physical manifestation of that sample. Subsamples will typically have a location, and samples don't necessarily have a formal location in the system, particularly if they're made up of lots and lots of subsamples that might be scattered around all over the place. Now, it's certainly possible to make a sample that has a single subsample, in which case the sample and the subsample are pretty much one and the same. But in most cases, in most labs, most of the time you'll be working with sets of subsamples that collectively represent a sample. And therefore, a sample can't have a single location because it's usually made up of subsamples, and the subsamples might be scattered in many different locations. So in this case, I can see this particular subsample is located in my main freezer room. It's in a particular freezer. It's on shelf 1, and it's in freezer box 1. And if I want to, I can actually go ahead and go back to the main sample again. And if I'm curious to see where the other subsamples are located, I can take a look at the listing of the different subsamples for that sample, and I can see here all of the unique identifiers for all of those subsamples. But if I want to, I can use this icon here or anywhere else that I see it in RS Inventory. I'm going to change that from the global ID to its current location. And that's going to show me where my different subsamples are physically located. And I can see that not all of these subsamples are in the same freezer. Some are in one freezer, others are in a special box, some are on my colleague Vida's bench where she's using them in an experiment. So I get an immediate sense of where these different samples are. And in fact, I can go ahead and say I'd like to see where all of these different subsamples are. So this particular sample is made up of many, many, many subsamples. And you can see that they're actually scattered around all over the place in different freezers based on how they're being used throughout the lab. Okay, so let's go back to the main list of containers. And what I'm going to do now is I'll show you that currently we're looking at these containers in what's called a list view. And list view is very much analogous to the list view in the RSpace ELN in that it's really just a simple flat list of items. And again, if I want to, although I can see here the global ID of these unique containers, I can, if I want to, go ahead and see other information, like for example their location to see where they are in the lab. If it's a container that's held at the top level, it will say so here. Or I could go ahead and see when they were last modified, or if I want to, I can go ahead and see who owns each of these containers. So RSpace Inventory is set up with quite flexible and open permissions, but they're generally based on lab membership. Each member of a lab can see all of the samples and containers that are in that lab, but each sample or container has a specific owner, and editing of that sample or container is often limited to the owner of that item. Now this is useful, but all I'm really looking at right here is a list of containers. And if I want to, I could select one of those. And I can see then a list of action items. I'll see some basic actions here, and there may be additional actions to me available here depending on the item. But I can also go ahead and change how I've selected some of these items. If I want to, I could see just the ones that belong to me. Or I could see just the ones that actually belong to someone else other than me. Or I can go ahead and unselect everything if I want to. Let's imagine now, though, that I'd like to really tunnel down into some of these containers and see a more hierarchic view. So what I can do here is I can go to the Change View menu, and I can change this into Tree mode. And what that will do is that's going to now generate a navigational tree for me that will let me browse through the hierarchy of all of the different containers in my lab. So I can again start with freezer room 2, and I can look inside a particular freezer, and then I can look inside a particular freezer box. And here you can see that I'll see 3 samples inside this box. But if I were to go to some other box, I might see a different list of items that are in there. And I can jump to any of these items anytime simply by clicking at them. So now I'll go ahead and I'll look in maybe this plastic tub container. And I can see there's some sort of sub box inside that. So I could go ahead here and click on the antibody sample, and I'll be taken to look at that exact subsample, and the details card will show me everything I need to know about that, including its location. If I want to, I can go ahead and make changes to this by clicking the edit button, and that will allow me to do things like change the preview image or start adding information into some of these metadata fields. I can still sort the tree view based on various different parameters that I can choose. So I'm going to sort this now by name instead of last modified date. And that's going to arrange these containers in a way that I've previously set up by making sure that I place a number in front of the names of some of these containers. And that shows me my most important containers at the top of the list. So you can see we've got 2 freezer rooms, and I've also created a container that represents my main lab area. So I'm going to click on that. And when I click there, you can see here that we have a little photograph of the lab. But this particular container is of a type that allows me to physically add the locations of certain sorts of things. So down here you can see an expanded image of the lab area. And what I've done here is I've actually designated what materials are inside which cabinets and cupboards inside the lab. So if I mouse over one of these supplies, I'll be able to immediately see what's being kept in that particular cupboard. So if I'd like to get access to the place where this particular well type is kept, I can go ahead and click open here. And now I can see a preview image of the resource that's in that cupboard. I can see exactly where it's located in my system. I can go ahead and see some of the details for that item. And if I want to, I can even go ahead and edit it and start specifying where certain samples are in a particular well. So there may or may not be samples placed into this well right now. So this brings us to another principle, and that's the fact that if I now go back to my master list of containers, it's important to realize that there are actually 3 different types of containers that you can create inside RSpace. So at any time I can go ahead and click the create button, and I can say I'd like to make new samples or I'd like to make new containers. Let's start with a container option first of all. The first thing RSpace will do is ask me whether or not I want this container to contain a simple list of items, whether I want the items to be arranged in a grid, as you might see in perhaps a 96 well plate, or a 10 by 10 freezer box, or any other grid pattern, or whether or not I want to set this up as what's called a visual container. So a visual container is defined by an image of that container onto which you can place storage spaces that show you the exact physical location of the different items that are inside that container. Let's go ahead and start by making something very simple. Let's make a list container, and we'll just call it box Z. And we'll go ahead and we'll say that it's a list container, and we'll say that this box can contain either subsamples or containers. Now, if this were a top-level container like a room, I might define that it can only contain other containers. And this would make sense because we generally don't leave our samples just sort of laying around on the floor or on the bench. In a large container like a room, typically there are always only going to be sub-containers in that room. And then inside those sub-containers, there may be other sub-containers or there may be subsamples. If this were a smaller container, perhaps this box is something small inside a freezer, and perhaps it's not going to contain any sub-containers. Perhaps it's only going to contain subsamples. So I can choose which of these options I'd like to turn on for this container. Let's say this particular one can only contain subsamples. And then for a description, we'll just say that it's a gray box. And if I wanted to, I could go ahead and some tags. And I even had the option to add additional custom fields to describe attributes of this particular container or any other container that I might be working with. I'll go ahead and leave that for now. So now I'll go ahead and I'll save that. And we've successfully just made a new simple container that's going to contain a list of items. So now if we want to put items into that box, we can either go to create and make samples to add to that box, or I could go to my list of samples and I could place some samples that I already have into that box. So for example, let's go ahead and say that I'd like to take sample 3 and I'd like to take a closer look at the details of sample 3 and understand what subsamples it's made up of. Sample 3 apparently is made up of just a single subsample. So I'll select it and I'll say move. Now I'll go ahead and say I'd like to place that in a particular container. If I'd like to, I could move it to a bench, but I'm not going to do that for now. I'm going to put it inside a container. The system is smart enough to know that chances are I probably want to put it in this box that I recently made. So I'll just go ahead and select that. Since there are no grid positions or image positions to move that subsample to, this box is just going to contain samples in a flat, unorganized list. So this is a nice, simple way to store things in a sample box, but it doesn't really necessarily show me their location within that container. But that's okay. I don't need to know the container location. I just need to know that this sample is inside box Z for now. So I'll go ahead and say move, and that's now going to place that item into box Z. Alright, so now here I am looking at my main list of containers again. And you'll notice I don't see box Z in this list because box Z is a brand new container that I just made. So actually it is still sitting on my bench. And I've now got box Z on my bench with one of my samples that I've just moved there. So what I can do now is I can select that box. And I can say I'd like to move that box to a particular location. I can choose to put it on someone else's bench if I want to. I can put it in a container on my own bench. Or I can add it to my main list of containers. So what I'll do with this is I'll actually go ahead and I'll place this into my lab, and I'll say that I'd like to put it down in one of my cupboards. So the system is actually giving me the option here to place that sample not just in room 2, but also in a specific location in room 2. And I can define the location that I'd like to move that box Z to by simply clicking an empty location that represents a cupboard inside that room to select it. And now I'll go ahead and I'll say move. And now box Z containing sample 3 is going to be moved to that particular cupboard. And I can verify that by going back to my main container list, closing up the filter box here, looking at the main room, looking at the map of the room in the image layout, mousing over the representation of box Z to see what's in it. And if I want to, I can say open here. And you'll see that here's box Z and here's sample 3 inside it. Now you may immediately notice that box Z is not very useful right now because it doesn't have any preview image associated with it. So I have no idea what it looks like, which is going to make it hard for me to find it later. So while I think of it, I'll click edit here, and then I'll say add image. And now I'm either going to use my phone to take an image of that particular box container, or I can just browse through a list of existing containers that I already have. So let me go ahead and just choose a container from within my master list of containers here. Let's just choose a fairly generic looking cardboard box here and say upload, and that's going to add an image of that box. Now obviously a good best practice here is to use actual photographs of your actual containers and your actual samples as these preview images, because the whole point of this feature is it's going to let you visually recognize and search for containers, locations and samples throughout your lab. But for demonstration purposes this box will do just fine. So now I'll click save. And you'll notice now that if I go back to the room and I take a quick look at that location map, you can actually see his box Z here, and you can see the image of that box has been added. And if I want to, I could select it and say open here. That's another way to reach it. Or I could mouse over its little icon badge and I could choose open from here if I want to do that. Okay, so much for making some very simple containers in the RS Inventory Management System. Now let's move on to something a little bit more complex. Let's go ahead now and say that we'd like to make some samples. So I'm going to say create a new sample, and then that's going to take me to basically the new creation sample wizard over here. You can see here right now I have a range of choices for creating my sample. One of the first things to note is that we have a whole bunch of different sorts of existing sample templates that I could use for building new samples. And these might be templates that either came with the system when it was first deployed to your server, or they may be sample templates that were built by you or your colleagues that you have access to, which you can use to make new samples. I'm going to go ahead and use an FFPE tissue block template for creating my next sample. So I'll choose that template. I know a little bit about this subject, and I know this template quite well since I made it myself, and I can actually verify that by looking at the info for that sample, and that's going to show me some of the different items that are in here and the different fields that I've previously created. So yeah, sure enough, this is definitely the sample I'm interested in. I could even click on the template unique ID here to see even more information about that template, and that's going to show me the full template and all of the details of what it's going to create for me, including things like the owner of that template, which in this case is me. But anyway, let's go back to create sample, and we'll go to the new sample page, and I'll say I'd like to make something based on the FFPE tissue page. And now I'll go ahead and I'll give this a name. Let's make sure we are naming this after a tissue that I actually have an image of. So I'm going to check my images in my local computer to see what we could use as an example here. Let's go ahead and say we're basing this on gastric cancer. No, that image is kind of complicated. Let's use a brain tissue image instead. So we'll just make this a brain sample. Okay, so what I'll do here is I'll go ahead and I'll say this is going to be FFPE brain tissue, and then I'll say add image, and then I'll navigate to that image that I was just looking at a moment ago. So let's go ahead and look at my tissue subfolder, and I'll pick that brain tissue image and I'll say upload. That's going to give me a preview of my sample. And now I can go ahead and start filling in some of the details in the sample details area. So this is an FFPE block, and those things are stable for a long time. So we can probably go ahead and say this isn't going to expire until 2025. And let's go ahead and call it, say, I don't know, the 1st of January on that particular year. So we'll have plenty of time before this particular sample expires in January the 1st, 2026. You can specify whether or not this sample was made by the lab that you work in, whether or not it was purchased from a vendor. In future releases of RS Inventory, these choices will then have effects on features and other kinds of metadata that you can add to the sample. So it's a good idea to choose wisely here. Don't choose randomly. Actually do select whichever one is most appropriate for your sample type. For now, we'll say this was lab created. This is going to be an item that actually can be kept at ambient temperature. So we'll just go ahead and say that it's going to be kept at room temperature. I can put in a description here. The original description that's in here right now is drawn from the template. And this description currently is perfectly adequate for what I'm doing here today, so I'll just leave that as it is now. For tags, I've already entered some tags on a template. We'll just leave those. Then there are some more fields here. So the donor number for this particular sample is this. And the block number for this sample is the same thing with a 1 appended onto it. So we'll just take that figure and we will paste it down here. And we'll say 0.1 as our block number. For gender and race, we'll say this is female and it's an Asian donor. For the height and weight, I have no idea how tall this person was, but we could say something like 158 centimeters. I'm just going to guess some crazy weight here. Let's say, I don't know, 79 kilograms. And then for the pathology report, I'll probably skip this step, but if I wanted to, I could just copy and paste in some text from my path report. Then I could go ahead and put in the indication if there's a disease here. I could put in the known date of birth of the donor. In this case, let's go ahead and say this person was born in, let's make them pretty insanely senior. We'll say they were born in 1920 and on September the 1st, and say OK. And I could also go ahead and say whatever date the surgical procedure was that collected the sample. Let's go ahead and say that was, a couple of days ago. Let's say OK here. Alright, so now I've got a couple of other options here. The template allows me to specify some choices here. So let's say this one, this is normal tissue and it doesn't show any pathology. Now let's imagine that we already know that this particular FFPE block is made up of a single parent block plus 10 sections that have been cut from that block. So let's go ahead and say that there are a total of 11 units that go with this particular sample. And we'll go ahead and we'll say that these items essentially are unitless, and that's what the template has already told me. Now in some other templates we might have the ability to say that there are so many grams per subsample, or so many milliliters per subsample if it was a fluid sample. So there's a lot of customization and configurability to sort of describe the physical properties of your sample, but in this case it's just 11 units. And now we'll say save. Alright, so we've now created a little cohort of samples. And we can see here in the listing of the subsamples here that they've been automatically numbered in a logical way that kind of makes sense. I can see 10 of them, or I could see all of them at once. In this case, it's going to be 11 total. I can see the unique identifier for these. Right now, though, these new samples, because they've just been created, if I look at current location, I'll see that they are all sitting on my bench. So that's not really very useful. Maybe I'd like to put these somewhere specific. So what I can do now is I can go ahead and just select the whole lot by clicking the select all button, and that will select all of my samples. Now I'm going to say move, and now I'm going to move them to some logical location that would make sense. So I'm going to look at containers. I think I even have an FFPE here boxes somewhere, and if I want to, I can just search for a suitable container like this. So here we've got a couple of drawers within an FFPE particular item. It looks like these cabinets have all been generally reserved for particular tissue types. So I might have to make a new container, but for the purposes of demonstration today, I'll just go ahead and say I want to put it into a particular drawer. So these drawers are all full for this one. These drawers too probably are also full. That's fine. We'll have this demonstration sample share a drawer with another donor, which actually is a bit of a no-no, but let's go ahead and say it anyway. So we're going to drop those samples into this drawer with this other donor, and now we'll say move. It's going to place all 11 of those samples into that particular drawer. Now if I needed to find those, I could go ahead and I could look at my container area, and I could probably go ahead now and sort that by last modified, and maybe reverse that. And also this is actually going to show me just things at the top level for now. So let's go ahead and look for the FFPE container itself. And we'll just look at containers. And we will use our little filter block here to limit that to what we really want to see. And to make this easier, I'm even going to go ahead and turn this into what's called tree view. And that will show me my two major cabinets, and I think this is the one that I just put those samples in. Sure enough, they're there. So the other way that I could look at this container array if I wanted to is I could actually swap to something else also called card view, and card view gives me much larger previews of the containers and their content. So this is great because it helps me search for things more visually. So for example, if I go back to tree view, or if I just click on the FFPE container here, and I go ahead and I look inside that container by, let's go ahead and look at it in tree view initially, and maybe select this particular drawer, and now switch this into card view. This is actually going to allow me to see my samples in a much kind of a more visual way, where I can actually look at little previews of these images and understand better what I'm looking at. So in this case we can see we've got all of the images of the brain tissue for some of the samples, But then if I wanted to, I could probably actually go ahead and look at some of the other samples that are on this item. So for example, if I go back to this drawer and I look at maybe a different drawer in here, perhaps this one, and now I look at this in card view, you can see here that the images will look different because we have different samples in here. In some cases we just have some generic FFPE blocks. In others we've got a specific sample that in this case came from a liver sample. So you can use these different views to control what kind of information you're looking at. And you can see there are advantages and disadvantages to the different views. The biggest advantage of the card view is that now I see these nice big preview images. But the downside is that it takes up a lot of the screen, so I don't see many items on the screen at one time. If I'd like to see a wider list of the things that are in that particular container, I can go back to list view, and that's going to make the list more compact and make some of the key information jump out at me a little more easily. So you can customize how you're looking at the system to better locate exactly what you want based on the way that your own visual system works and based on what you think you'll be able to recognize fastest when you're looking for particular samples in a particular container. Now let's consider some other ways that you can build new samples or create new templates that can then allow you to make samples that match your particular needs. So here we're looking at the main navigational column and in list view, and you'll notice that one of the things that I can do if I want to is I can select a sample and I can go ahead and say I'd like to duplicate it, and that will make a whole new copy of the sample and all of its subsamples based on this particular sample ID number. If you haven't already noticed, you can see that you can get a little bit of information about what you're looking at here from the way that the unique identifier is structured. If it starts with an SA, then you're looking at a sample. If I go to my main filter area and I say I just want to look at subsamples, you'll notice that now in the list all of these items start with an SS standing for subsample. You don't necessarily have to call these subsamples. You can adjust the language of the subsample area to refer to these as aliquots or pieces or portions or other things that are suitable for your particular field of research. If we go ahead and we change the main filter block to just look at containers, you'll see that in this case all of the unique identifiers start with an IC standing for inventory container. So you can get clues about what you're looking at from looking at each item. Notice also that you can get clues in the details area too as well, because these details cards are color coded. So the containers are colored blue. The subsamples are colored this sort of a dark green color, this forest green. And if we look at a sample, you'll see that the sample cards are colored more of a sort of a grass green color. So there's a little bit of color coding and also some iconography here to let you know exactly what kind of resource you're looking at when you look at the details card. So you can duplicate your samples, or similarly if I go to a container and select a container, I can also duplicate the containers too as well. And that's one fast way to make new types of containers and samples. And once you've duplicated something, you can then just go ahead and edit it. So for example, if I select this item here, the plastic tub container, and I say duplicate, that's going to make a new copy of that container. And what I can do then, if I want to, I can then go ahead and simply click the edit button, and that will allow me to then start editing the characteristics of this specific instance of that container to meet my needs. So this is a fast way to make new containers and samples if you want to. When you're done editing, you can either just click save if you've made any changes, or cancel if you haven't made any changes. Notice also that from the action menu at the top of the card, there are various other things that I can perform with this resource too as well. I could, as well as editing it, I can duplicate it from the card itself if I want to. I can move it within my container hierarchy and place it in other containers that have been previously set up to be able to hold containers. I could transfer ownership of this item from one user to another, and RSpace is smart enough to give me a list of people to choose from, or I can just search for a user using text. So if I need to transfer ownership of entire containers, samples, or subsamples, I can certainly do that at any time. Again, the permission structure of RS Inventory is designed to be quite free and open. You often will find that you're not inhibited by various different sorts of blocks that are caused by permissions issues. The assumption is that within a particular lab, most of the users will be cooperative, will respect each other's materials, and will be able to see anything they need to see that is stored currently anywhere at all in the lab. So it is quite an open system. It's designed to help labs have good awareness of what else is in their lab. But you won't be able to see the supplies that are in other people's labs unless you join their lab group. Notice that we also have over here an info button, and when I click that, I'll see a QR code that's been generated for the sample. This is sort of a pre-adaptation for future features in RSpace. In this first release of RSpace Inventory Module, you won't see a lot of use of barcodes just yet. That technology is coming. It's going to be in a later release. If you look at the roadmap of our product, which is available from the RSpace Inventory Module Hub online, you'll be able to see a full copy of our roadmap and understand what sorts of features we'll be adding in subsequent releases. We're really happy with this first release, but we are just getting started. There are all sorts of great technologies coming for future releases of the product. Just like in the main navigational tree, if you select an item and you want to see additional actions that may be available to you, you can click the 3 dots here to see different actions, and you can do the same over here on the card to see actions that might not necessarily fit in the top row. One of the actions you'll often see here is the ability to move this particular item to the trash. Items that are moved in the trash will sit there pretty much forever currently, and you can then, if you need to, examine items in the trash to find them and retrieve them if you need to. So if you trash things, you won't be losing data about containers or samples because you can still actually access those samples in the trash area. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about templates. Over here we can see in the main control panel I can access my existing list of templates. And what's very nice is that I can select some of these templates, and if I want to, I can duplicate templates too to make variants on common workflows that are slightly different from the way that I'm doing it currently. Alright, so this is now a template. You can see up here we have a sample ID number that starts with an IT standing for inventory template, which tells me that we're looking at a template card right now. So now I can say edit here, and I can edit this template by either replacing the image or by editing the content of some of these fields. But I can also do more elaborate edits by going to the bottom of the page, and then from here I can go ahead and say add new field, and that will allow me to add a field of a specific type. So just like in the ELN area, when you're building forms to control workflows in your experiments, you can add different sorts of fields on templates too, and these can include choices, dates, number fields, radio buttons, plain text, slightly more elaborate formatted text, links to things out on the World Wide Web, and also the time. These are all potential choices you can add. So let's go ahead maybe and say we'll add a choice field initially. And now I can click on the choose options area, and that's going to let me go ahead and add some choices here. So I could say that my first choice is going to be, let's imagine we're working with a particular antibody here, and we could say that the first choice is going to be IgG or something. And then we can go ahead and for the next one we can add something like IgA. And for the next one we could add IgE. So you get the idea. You can add fixed response items to this choice field if you want to, and then when you're done you can just go ahead and add a name to as well. We'll call this antibody type, and then we'll go ahead and say save. So adding those new fields onto a template is quite easy. You can also, if you want to, you can, just like you can with containers and samples, you can go ahead and select samples, and you can actually duplicate the templates too as well. And this will allow you to build a duplicate template that you could then vary to change slightly from the original. So creating new templates. Okay, so there is currently a bit of a knack to creating new kinds of templates. And the key here is that templates, when they are first made, they are based on samples. So in order to make a new template, you must either select a sample you would like to base that template on, or you'll need to make a new sample that you can then base the template on. So if you'd like to build a template completely from scratch, so where you have freedom to do whatever you want in that template, one strategy that you use is that you can say create sample, and then you can choose the simplest type of sample that we offer as being your sample. And so let's go ahead and choose, there's a template here called just simply sample. Now, samples must be based on templates, but ironically, templates also must be based on samples. So in order to create a template, you first have to make a sample. And one way to do that is, if you don't know what kind of template you're going to make, just make the simplest sample type available from the sample template. And now you can go ahead and say next. Let's not worry about changing any of these fields. I'll just say save now. So now if I go to my bench, I'll be able to find the sample that I just made. I can select it here and load the card for that sample. And now what I can do is I can say that I would like to be able to turn this into a template. So I can actually, let's go to the sample that we created first of all. I was actually looking at the subsample for a parent sample there that I made. So that's first sample that I made was made automatically with just one subsample. But you can only actually make the template itself from the sample, not from the subsample. So let's go ahead and say create template. And now I can go ahead and give this a name. I could call this, something like a... Perhaps I work in a lab where we keep live frogs in a culture area, and I need to be able to define the characteristics of each frog using a sample card. So I can go ahead and do that by making this new template. And then what I can do is I can go to my templates area, and I can click on that template that I just made, and then I can start editing it. So once I go into edit mode, then I have the option to change any of the things here. And you'll see here's one of the places where I can adjust the language of what we'd like subsamples for this sample to be called. Currently, these are the only options available. We're actually going to add some additional options here to this. And then eventually we can then start adding new fields, as we saw before, by clicking the new field button, choosing a field type, entering any information that we'd like to be in that field, and then saving our template once we've done that. And once we've built the template up this way, it's then going to appear in our master template area anytime we look at it. And so now if I need to register a new frog that we're adding to our frog collection, I can go ahead and say create sample, and then from within the template area, I can go ahead and choose that frog template in order to base it on the template that I just made. So yeah, in summary, currently when you build templates, you have to base them on a sample, which means you can either select an existing sample or you can create a new sample with basic characteristics, which you can then immediately turn into a template and then start editing to create a template that suits your needs. Templates are only used to create samples, and the subsamples within those samples are then made automatically or are created based on the requirements that you specify when you create the sample. Containers don't need templates. Containers are very simple to build, and we don't currently support templates for containers. But what you can do is you can create containers set up a particular way, and then you can just simply duplicate those containers at any time to make new ones. What I'm going to do now is walk you through a very simple use case of actually selecting some samples and using them in an experiment in your ELN. So I'm going to start by looking for a set of chlorella samples that I know are in my system somewhere. I can go ahead and make sure that I'm just looking at containers first of all to make sure, just looking at samples first of all to make sure that I'm ruling out things like containers and templates and so forth. So let's search for that text string. And now I can additionally filter this to make sure that I'm only looking at subsamples. So I don't want to look at groups of subsamples. I actually want to look at my flat list of subsamples. And I can see now that the little SS designation here is telling me that these are all subsamples. And furthermore, I'm actually going to sort this list because I'm really just interested in the 5 that I made most recently. So I'm going to sort this by date modified and make sure I'm looking at most recent to least recent. And here I can see my 5 most recently created chlorella samples. So I'm going to select 5 of these. These are the ones that I'd actually like to use in my experiment today. And I'm going to go ahead and move these onto my bench. And the reason why I'm doing that is because once those samples have been moved onto my bench, it's going to tell my colleagues that if they look for these samples and they can't find them, they know that they're going to be physically actually on my bench because I'm currently using them in an experiment. So that's always a good best practice to make sure that you are moving things that you're working with to your bench. And if I check my bench here, sure enough, I can see those chlorella samples have been added here. Now, if I wanted to and I changed my mind, I could always go ahead and move them back. And the way that I could do that is I could go ahead and change the information column to the previous location setting. And that's going to tell me where these samples were before they were on my bench. So now I can select the 5 samples that I just moved to my bench. And now I instantly know where they were. They were located in a container called 96 well plate previously. So I'm going to say move. I'll go ahead and say I'd like to search for a particular container. I can enter 96 as my search term. That will find the 96 well plate. And now, in a rather clever piece of technology, I can select 5 spaces here and say move. It's going to move those 5 samples back to the original location where they just came from, if that's what I want to do. And this would also be what I would do after the experiment has finished. I can move them back from my bench to their original location. And the way that I'll know what their original location is because I can actually set this little area here to tell me that what I'm looking at here is the previous location. So if I want to, I could go ahead here and also deselect these by saying I want to go back to selecting none. And if I want to here, I can go back to showing their current location. That tells me that all of these are on the bench. Okay, so now that I have these samples on my bench, what I'm going to do now is go to the ELN area, and I'm going to look for an experiment inside a particular notebook. And I previously actually tagged the experiment that I'm going to be doing so I can find it more easily. So I'll search by tags, and I'll look for chlorella, and you can see it auto fills in here in our search engine in the main ELN area. And that will find exactly the experiment that I'm looking for. I can open that up now. And we can see that this experiment is actually one page inside a notebook. So here we are, we're looking at the experiment, and there are actually some instructions here telling me to go ahead and select the 5 samples that I'll be using and attach them as what's called a list of materials, or LOM. So it's even giving me the name that it wants me to assign to that list of materials. So I'm going to copy that with my keyboard, and now I'm going to click on this icon here, which allows me to interact with the inventory system, and I'll say create a new list of materials. I'm going to call this list of materials 5 times chlorella as instructed by the experimental template, and I'll just say this is a set of algae subsamples. And now I'll add those items to this list. So what I'll do here is I'll look at my bench because I already know that's where those samples are. I'll select the ones that I am going to use today. That's these. And say choose. And it's then going to add them to a list here. Now what I can do now is I can even specify how much I'll be using in the experiment today. And I only need a relatively small amount. I'm going to need about 10 microliters of each of these. So what I'll do is I'll click on the consumed quantity area, and I'll say that I would like to use 10 microliters of each of these samples. So I can go through here and do the same thing here for each of these. And you'll notice that when I do this, the system immediately calculates how much is remaining in that subsample after I've pulled out these 10 microliters I'll be using in the experiment today. And ultimately, there's going to be all sorts of useful alarms and things associated with this in later editions of the product, so that when you're working with in this case, actually, it's telling me I've got 1 mil here and I need to change, because this one's in a different volume, let's change that to 10 microliter units. And now I can go ahead and say done here. So it's telling me exactly how much I have left of each of the samples, each of the subsamples, and it's telling me how much I used in this particular experiment. Now in future releases, this will do things like trigger alarms if you're getting close to having consumed all of the sample and so forth. But for now, it's just helping you track manually how much material is in each subsample and how much you've used in a particular experiment. So now I'll go ahead and say save. Alright, so now anytime I want, I can click on this icon to examine that list of materials. And I can also create new lists of materials if I want to. Another nice feature here is if I want to, I can click this icon, and that will actually generate a printable version of this list of materials. And this might be useful for any number of reasons. So for example, in this case, I happen to know that all of these are on my bench, but if I haven't moved them to my bench yet, this would be a nice printable list that I can generate that will show me the location of where these samples are, so that then I can take this paper list with me out into the storage area, look for the samples that I need, and bring them back to my bench. Okay, so I can close this list now. And you'll see here that the icon for the list of materials associated with this text field tells me that there's one list of materials associated with this text field. Currently, you can only actually associate these lists of materials with text fields in your RSpace ELN experimental write-up. So if I'm working with an experimental write-up that has other types of field, I think this one is mainly just a text field too as well. Yeah, these are all just text fields. But if there were number fields or choice fields, I wouldn't be able to associate lists of materials with those fields yet, although that is coming in future releases. I'm looking to see if there's an example of a different field type here. No, not really. These are all text fields, but you can see each text field allows me to associate as many different lists of materials with that field as I want. So therefore, I can actually set up my experiments so that I have text fields in specific places to let me create new lists of materials to represent samples that I'll be introducing into the experiment at that particular point in the experiment. So you can have multiple lists of materials, and they can be scattered through the experiment associated with specific text fields as you work. Again, when I'm done using the experiment, using the samples in this experiment, I can in fact go back to my bench, look at the samples that I used here, and if I want to, I can select the ones that I used in the experiment, and I can now move them back to their previous location. And a lovely feature in RSpace is the fact that I can figure out what previous location they were actually in by using the, let's go ahead and change this back to none, and now I'll say I'd like to see the previous location for my selected items. So now I can go ahead and select the ones that were in that 96 well plate, and as we saw earlier, I could actually move those back to their original location if I want to. And this is a lovely feature because all of us have a tendency to completely forget where we pulled a particular sample from before we put it on our bench. And this is one way that you can track that, so the system will tell you where you need to return these to make sure that your lab stays well organized. Okay, so we've looked at just a very brief collection of some of the key features of the system that you would need to get started. There are lots and lots of other samples that you can dig into. Luckily, as always, RSpace has generated great documentation for the RS inventory area. So at any time, I can go ahead and visit the RS inventory hub and see that in a new full view. This is a general information area that will tell you more about this module, how it was developed, and also show you the roadmap for new features of the things that you can expect in subsequent releases. If you need to search for something specific, you can go ahead and say, maybe you'd like to know more about making samples. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and say, I'd like to understand how to create a sample. You can click on that search result, and it will give you a good description of how to do that. So everything that you've seen today in this movie is all well documented in our written online documentation, and I do encourage you to consult that to clarify for yourself any of the details that you might need to know for working with your particular laboratory setup and with your particular types of samples. As always, you can also always contact us. Don't forget, in fact, that of course one easy way to do that is through the help system itself. If you want to, you can go ahead and just click chat with us at any time, and that will open up a live chat session with our support team that you can use to then ask us questions about anything that you've seen here today. Thanks for your attention. We hope you enjoy working with this new module.